Why was the woman so quiet while everyone else filled the air with noise? The motor pool at Desert Ridge was never silent. Not in the heat of day, not in the cool edge of night. Engines growled, tools clanged, soldiers joked too loudly just to cover how tired they were. Yet in the middle of it all, one figure seemed carved out of stillness. Rowan Hale, crouched beside a battered generator, socket wrench in one hand, voltage probe in the other. She moved without hesitation, each turn, each adjustment precise, like she'd done this 1,000 times before. But the others didn't see that. Bet you she doesn't even know what a load balancer does, Private Granger muttered, tossing a wrench from palm to palm. His voice carried just far enough for the group clustered nearby to hear. Corporal Diaz, leaning against a fuel drum, smirked as he chewed on a toothpick. She probably just Googles this crap. Civilian hires, pure charity cases. A younger soldier, Luke, frowned but said nothing. He only watched her, the way her shoulders never slumped, the way her fingers hovered steady over exposed wiring. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't searching. She knew. Still, the mocking was easier than admitting they didn't understand how she could fix what they couldn't. She didn't respond. Not to them, not to the barbs that circled around her day after day. Her silence unnerved them more than any insult could. Because silence, in a place where everyone lived on rank, ritual, and noise, meant she didn't need their approval, and no one knew what to do with that. The sun bore down on the compound, brutal and unyielding, pressing sweat into every collar. Rowan worked without shade, sleeves tied at her waist, tank top darkened by heat. Dust clung to her skin, her hair pinned back beneath a faded cap. From behind, she looked like any other contractor, unremarkable, ordinary. That was the trick. That was why she'd lasted this long. The generator she crouched over was a Gent 6, half-fried, half-forgotten. Most of the crew had written it off weeks ago, but Rowan had been on it for hours, patient, deliberate. She rewired the burnt-out capacitor by hand, bypassed a loop others swore was dead, and with one final calibration the machine coughed, stuttered, then roared to life. The sudden thunder of power silenced the jeers. Her hands fell to her knees, her chest rising slow and steady. She didn't smile. She didn't even look at them. Just sat back on her heels, pulled the damp fabric of her shirt away from her skin, and wiped her face. And in that moment, everything shifted. The back of her jumpsuit caught on a jagged edge of metal. The fabric ripped, not much, just enough. Enough for sweat to cling, enough for the sun to burn against bare skin, enough for black ink to emerge. At first it was just a sliver, a jagged line running vertical, too straight, too deliberate to be random. Then the fabric fell further and the full shape came into view. Diaz's smirk collapsed. His toothpick froze between his teeth. Granger stopped tossing the wrench. Luke's eyes widened, his throat suddenly dry. The tattoo was stark, merciless, unlike anything that belonged to decoration. A broken crimson sword speared through a skeletal mask. Around it, 4 jagged lightning bolts clawed outward. The ink was old, weathered into her skin. It didn't look new. It looked earned. Granger blinked. That's not just some ink." Luke's voice cracked. "I've seen that before. I swear to God I have." Diaz's tone dropped lower, almost reverent, almost afraid. "That crimson, crimson 17. The words sucked the air from the room. Even the generator's rumble felt muted. Rowan tugged her shirt back down, zipped the jumpsuit higher without a word. But it was too late. They had seen. And she knew what came next. The men stepped back instinctively, as if distance could soften the weight of what they'd witnessed. Rowan rose to her feet, slung her tools into a canvas bag, and walked out of the bay without looking at them. Her boots struck concrete in a rhythm that sounded louder than the machines themselves. No one followed. But they didn't need to, because in less than 10 minutes, a blurred snapshot of her back surfaced in the battalion's internal chat thread, captioned with only 2 words. "Spinal sigil confirmed." The comments lit up in seconds. "That's Crimson 17. No way, they were wiped out in Al-Hudra." Not if you believe what they fed the press. I heard one of them lived, but they vanished. And beneath it all, one final post, unsigned, untraceable. Some ghosts walk among us. By the time Rowan sat down in the mess hall that evening, the air had already changed. Forks clinked nervously. Conversations hushed as she passed. No one sat near her. No one dared. Her tattoo had spoken louder than her silence ever could. But the question whispered in every corner was the same. If Crimson 17 had died in fire, and Blood 13 years ago, then who was the woman drinking black coffee alone at the corner table? And what else was she hiding? Why did the general freeze when he saw just one blurred image? In his office, behind reinforced glass and humming screens, Major General Thomas Decker sat stone still. The printout in his hand had smudges where sweat from his palm had dampened the ink. It was a grainy still pulled from a security feed, the technician in the generator bay, her back turned, her jumpsuit torn. But he wasn't looking at the woman. He was staring at what marked her spine. The fractured sword, the skeletal mask, lightning bolts clawing outward. His stomach knotted. He had seen that symbol before, 13 years ago, under the burning sun of Al-Hudra, stamped into the shoulders of soldiers who never came home. Soldiers whose names he had signed off as dead. She shouldn't be here, Decker whispered almost to himself. His aide hesitated by the desk. Sir. Decker didn't answer. He was already back there, back in the desert where a convoy had rolled into a valley and never rolled out. Only wreckage had been recovered, blood on sand, a torn badge retrieved by drone, and a report marked, "No survivors." That was the official truth, the kind of truth men like him were ordered to sign, and he had signed it. But now that truth was unraveling. The photo trembled slightly in his grip, because if the mark was real, then so was she, Rowan Hale, a name he remembered seeing buried in black ink. Lieutenant, convoy engineer, status MIA, presumed KIA, body unrecovered. He leaned heavily against his desk. Ghosts, he thought, some ghosts don't stay buried. Meanwhile, on the ground, Rowan felt the change long before she heard the whispers. At breakfast, soldiers stood and left when she sat down. On equipment sheets her name was crossed out, red ink scrawled over it, a different name penciled in above hers. In the corridor, she could hear the faint click of a phone camera when she passed, though no one looked directly at her. She had seen this before, not the details, the behavior, the shrinking silence, the deliberate isolation, the quiet, coordinated effort to make her presence unbearable until she either broke or vanished. For the second time in her life, Rowan Hale was being erased. She didn't fight it, she adapted, she always had. When her badge was flagged and her clearance revoked, she brought her own tools. When her toolbox was broken into, she rearranged it herself, knowing full well it meant someone had been searching. When her requests for parts were delayed, she stripped scrap and soldered from pieces others had thrown away. But every night, when the work was done and the desert wind whispered through the glass of the barracks lounge, she sat alone, fingers wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, watching her reflection until her own eyes startled her, because sometimes they looked like a stranger's. Al-Hudra had looked the same sand, the same heat, the same static taste of dust and gun oil. The only difference now was that she was alone. No convoy, no brothers, no radio check-ins, just her, breathing in silence, carrying the weight no one else remembered. The system around her seemed to bristle with suspicion. Conversation stopped when she entered. A vent above her locker whirred louder than the others, out of sync, hiding the faint shudder of a camera lens. Her badge beeped red at checkpoints she used daily. And though no one said her name aloud, she could feel it, the truth that had slipped loose now circling back toward her. It was only a matter of time before someone pushed harder. That push came quietly on a Thursday. Corporal Diaz, the same man who had mocked her weeks before, slipped an envelope onto an officer's desk. Inside, screenshots of her login history, her badge photo, a note typed with deliberate detachment. Civilian contractor Rowan Hale has bypassed several access protocols. Recommend verification of service history. Behavior indicates possible impersonation. Request inquiry. He didn't hate her, he didn't even fear her, he simply didn't trust her. She didn't belong. And more importantly, she never tried to. Within 24 hours, Rowan was summoned to personnel. The office was sterile, white walls reflecting desert glare. A civilian clerk named Lewis greeted her with forced cheer and a clipboard. "Just a routine database sync," he said. But at the bottom of the form was a box she hadn't seen in years. Military service history, check 1. Active duty, reserve, never served, other. She stared at it for a long time, then marked other. When the form returned across the desk, Lewis's eyes flickered up nervously. "Would you mind elaborating?" Rowan said nothing. Behind those closed doors, officers scrolled her file. Civilian contractor, technical certifications, background clean, no DD-214, no ranks, no deployments, nothing. One of them frowned. Too clean, could be synthetic. Another whispered, or erased. And from that moment forward, the silence around Rowan sharpened. No one looked at her directly anymore. Not the mechanics, not the clerks, not even the soldiers who had once mocked her. It wasn't ridicule now. It was fear. Because even the strongest systems know when they've uncovered a ghost. At headquarters, Decker ordered files pulled from archives. Crimson 17 2011 to 2013. Topo scans, blackened debriefs, casualty logs, and then the names. Cortez, Nugan, Ferris, Lynn, all marked KIA, until one line caught his eye. Lieutenant Rowan M. Hale, status, MIA, presumed KIA, body unrecovered. The screen glitched, record unavailable, file purged or relocated. Decker's jaw tightened. Who scrubbed this? The sergeant shook his head. No log, no trace. It's not supposed to be possible. He leaned closer to the screen. The photo that remained faded, grainy, a woman in dust and blood with eyes fierce beneath a cracked helmet. He remembered her. He remembered signing her death away. Now she was here, alive. And that meant someone had lied. "Find her," he ordered quietly. "No alerts, no noise. I want to speak to Rowan Hale myself." As the staff dispersed, Decker remained, staring at that old photo, the soldier who had been buried with silence, now walking in his command as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed, because if Rowan Hale had survived, then the story of Crimson 17 wasn't just a tragedy. It was a cover-up, and he needed to know why. What do you say to a ghost who isn't supposed to exist? The sun was bleeding into the horizon, turning the desert sky into fire. Behind the mess hall, where sand dropped off into dunes, Rowan sat alone on a weathered bench. A tin cup of black coffee rested between her hands. She watched the horizon the way soldiers watched exits, with patience, with distance, with the knowledge that something always comes. She heard the steps before she saw the man. Heavy boots, a limp in the rhythm, the stride of someone who once carried weight he would never put down again. "Rowan," a voice called quietly, not a question, a test. Her jaw tensed. She didn't turn, not yet. The voice carried again, firmer now, cracked by age but steady. "I thought you were dead." She turned slowly. The man who stood there wasn't dressed for ceremony. His uniform was loose, collar unbuttoned, sleeves rolled against the heat. His face was carved deeper than she remembered, lines of command, of loss, of too many years spent making impossible choices. But his eyes, sharp and searching, hadn't changed. "Major General Thomas Decker." Rowan held his gaze unflinching. "You saw the footage." "Yeah," he said, his throat tightened. "We all did." For a long moment, neither spoke. The desert stretched between them, vast, indifferent, carrying with it the memories of a place neither wanted to revisit. "You're limping," she said finally, breaking the silence. "Too proud for a cane, too stubborn to stay retired." A flicker passed through his eyes, recognition, then something softer. "You still remember." "I remember all of them," Rowan replied, "even the ones whose bodies we never found." He sat beside her slowly, groaning as his knees protested. They faced the horizon together, the sun painting them both in harsh orange light. For a minute the silence returned, and it wasn't hostile. It was heavy, like the silence of a battlefield after fire, when the smoke is still rising and the dead are still cooling. "You didn't reach out," Decker said at last. 13 years we buried ghosts without names. You could have." "No," her voice was soft but absolute. "I couldn't." He turned, searching her face. "Why?" Her eyes stayed on the dunes. "Because they told me to disappear." The words landed between them like a stone in still water. Decker froze. "Who?" She didn't answer right away. Her hand traced the rim of her cup, steady, deliberate. "After the fire stopped, after the bodies were counted, they said if I surfaced, it would raise questions. Questions about the mission, about why there was no extraction clearance, about how Crimson 17 was sent into a valley with no way out." Decker's throat burned. He remembered the reports. He remembered the signatures. The way the words had been handed to him, neat and final. "They erased me," Rowan said, "and I let them." The silence stretched long. Decker's jaw clenched as he looked back at the horizon, at the place where memory blurred with guilt. "They erased you to protect themselves." Rowan's lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Not the mission, not the team, just themselves." "You were the best of them," he said, his voice low, rough, "and they buried that in silence." "I wasn't the best," Rowan answered. Her eyes finally flicked to him. They were steady, unblinking, but behind them was a weight that hadn't shifted in over a decade. "I was just the one who survived." Decker looked at her for a long moment. The wind picked up, brushing sand across the bench, hissing against metal. He thought about the convoy, the explosion, the loss that had followed, and then about the image of her now, alive, breathing, carrying all of it alone. "You didn't deserve this," he said. Rowan's laugh was bitter, sharp. "Deserve doesn't factor into survival. You know that as well as I do." He nodded slowly. He did know, he always had. For a time, they sat without words. Just two soldiers carved out of dust and memory, both trying to reconcile what the world had taken from them, and what it had forced them to carry. Finally, Decker leaned forward, elbows on his knees. His voice dropped. "You know they'll come for you now, they'll dig again. They'll want to know why you're here, why you never stayed gone." Rowan's expression didn't change. "I know." "Then what are you going to do?" She stared into the distance, into the dunes swallowing the horizon. "It's been so long since I was allowed to wear my own name. I don't even know what that means anymore." The general studied her face, the way the lines of grit and silence had shaped it, the way her eyes carried a lifetime without needing to say it aloud. And then he said something he hadn't expected to hear himself say. "Maybe it's time someone spoke, really spoke." Rowan's throat tightened. For years she had carried her silence like armor, and now, in the space of a single conversation, it felt like cracks had begun to spread. But before she could answer, Decker pushed himself to his feet. The limp was heavier now, the weight of old shrapnel grinding against bone. He stood against the bruised sky, looking older than she remembered, but still holding the authority of a man who had survived too much. "You're not invisible anymore," he said. Her eyes lifted to him, calm, steady, but beneath that something shifting. "I never pretended to be," she replied. He held her gaze for one last beat, then nodded once, not as a general, not as a commander, but as a man acknowledging the soldier beside him, the soldier who had been forced into silence and who now stood on the edge of being remembered. When he left, Rowan sat alone again. The cup cooled in her hands. The desert stretched before her, And for the first time in years, she felt something heavier than fear. She felt the weight of choice. Because silence had protected her all this time. But silence had also kept the truth buried. And the truth was rising. Why was the quiet mechanic suddenly standing at the front of the briefing room? The benches of Motorpool Bay 1 were full. Soldiers slouched with coffee cups, expecting another dry refresher on surge protection and tool safety. Nothing that couldn't be half heard through yawns. But when Rowan Hale walked to the front, clipboard in hand, zipped jumpsuit neat for the first time anyone could remember, the noise faded faster than usual. Luke leaned toward Granger. Why is she running the session? Granger rolled his eyes. Because command's too cheap to bring someone with a real uniform. Diaz crossed his arms, silent this time. Something in him, something he didn't want to name, was uneasy. Rowan didn't speak right away. She just looked at them one by one, eyes steady, voice unspoken but heavy. Then she clicked the projector remote. The blueprint of a Gen Power 9A filled the wall in pale blue light. "We're going to walk through power redistribution protocols," she said, her voice low but steady. "I'll be demonstrating a sequence used during hot operations redeployment scenarios." Some chuckled, hot ops, like she'd ever seen one. But her tone cut through them, sharper than the buzz of the projector. "Most of you will never need it, but if you do, you'll want to remember every second of what I show you." The laughter died. She moved across the diagrams with surgical precision, marking fault zones, rerouting sequences, manual overrides no handbook had ever taught. Her voice was calm, fast, but deliberate, like someone walking back through a memory step by step. Halfway through, Sergeant Riggs leaned forward, brow furrowed. "That sequence, that's not in the Army manual." "No," Rowan said. Her hand didn't shake as she pointed to the junction on the schematic. "It was tested in theater, under fire. Crimson 17 drafted it after we lost 4 men in a convoy blackout." The room went still. The words hit like shrapnel. Granger frowned, blinking. "Wait, you just said." Rowan paused. Slowly, deliberately, she unzipped her collar just enough to pull the neckline aside. The projector's glow caught on her skin. The jagged lightning bolt inked into her upper spine. Gasps rippled through the bay. Diaz stepped forward, voice unsteady. "You're not just a tech." Rowan's gaze locked on his. "Calm." "No," she said quietly, "I'm not." The murmurs rose, disbelief, awe, fear. Someone half reached for their comms, then hesitated. No one wanted to be the first to break the spell. "I didn't come here to hide," Rowan continued, her voice rising just enough to still the whispers. "But I didn't come here to be found either." Her words cut deep. Soldiers who had sneered now sat frozen. The tattoo, once a rumor, now lived in front of them. "You were in Crimson 17, Riggs said, almost reverent. "But they said we were gone." Rowan's voice was sharp now, carrying across the bay. "That there were no survivors." Her eyes swept across them. Each one shifted under her stare. The silence was different this time, not exclusion, not mockery. It was weight, recognition, fear of truth too large to hold. And then at the far end of the bay, the doors opened. Boots struck concrete, steady, heavy, commanding. Major General Thomas Decker entered without ceremony, without entourage. He didn't bark for attention, but the entire room snapped into silence as if pulled by a wire. Rowan stood at the front, still, unflinching. Her eyes met his. "You said you weren't here to be found," Decker said evenly. His voice carried through the bay. "But I think it's time you stop pretending you're invisible." Her reply was calm, almost cold. "I never pretended. You did that for me." Decker's face was unreadable. He stepped forward slowly, eyes never leaving hers. The weight in the room shifted with each step. "I signed your death certificate," he said. His voice cracked only slightly. "Your file was sealed, your name scrubbed, And now you're standing here in front of 50 soldiers, teaching systems no manual records. They exist where it counts, Rowan answered steady. In fire, in loss, in memory. Her words rang louder than any briefing. Decker turned his gaze to the room, soldiers frozen, jaws tight, hearts pounding. You all want answers, he said. No one spoke. He turned back to her. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, in recognition. Then let's give them some. He stepped aside, not as a general demanding obedience, but as a man making space for someone else to speak. Rowan felt every eye on her, the ones who mocked, the ones who doubted, the ones who had never believed. She raised a hand, fingers brushing the ink on her spine, her voice steady but low. This tattoo wasn't meant to be seen. It wasn't pride, it wasn't rebellion. It was how we found each other in the dark, in smoke, when radios died and orders meant nothing. I was the convoy engineer for Crimson 17. We weren't ghosts. We were soldiers. And when the mission failed, they didn't just bury our bodies. They buried our names. The silence was absolute. One voice finally rose, Riggs again, barely a whisper. Not anymore. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Rowan stood steady beneath their gazes. No bravado, no plea, just truth, raw and unhidden. And though she didn't show it, inside her chest her heart beat like it had 13 years ago, when fire and dust had closed over everything she'd ever known. Now standing in the open, she knew, silence had protected her, but silence had also chained her. And the chains had just broken. How do you face the man whose life you pulled out of fire when he thought you died in it? The room was frozen. Soldiers held their breath, unwilling to shift even in their seats. The projector still glowed against the wall, but no one looked at the schematics anymore. All eyes were on Rowan, all ears tuned to the silence between her and the general. Decker's voice broke it, low and rough, like gravel dragged across steel. Crimson 17, Convoy Bravo, 3rd Vehicle, Humvee Unit 3A, his gaze locked on her. You were the one driving the munitions crawler. Rowan's eyes flicked just barely, and then she nodded once. That's right. Decker's face changed. Not shock, not anger, recognition. His chest rose, sharp and uneven. You crawled through fire to reach me, he said. His hand unconsciously gripped the back of his thigh, where shrapnel scars still lay buried under skin. I was trapped in the overturned MRAP. My leg was shattered. And I cut you out, Rowan finished quietly. With wire cutters, while rounds were still flying, I dislocated your hip to drag you clear. Gasps rippled through the soldiers. They had heard rumors of that day, seen fragments in half-redacted reports, but none of them had expected the story to walk into the room alive. Decker's voice trembled, not with weakness but with memory. You blacked out before we reached the trench. I never knew who pulled me free. Rowan's eyes fell to the floor. You were the only one who didn't scream. The silence cracked wider. Decker's throat worked as if swallowing something jagged. They told me you died in the fire 10 minutes later. They needed someone to die, Rowan said, her voice flat. It made the cleanup easier. For a long moment, the bay seemed to tilt with the weight of it. Soldiers exchanged glances, their disbelief now tangled with a deeper question. If command could bury a soldier alive, what else could they bury? Decker wasn't asking that question. He was reliving the fire, the choking smoke, the heat that blistered skin through Kevlar, the weight of twisted metal crushing his leg, and then the silhouette through the flames. A soldier bent low, dragging, cutting, refusing to let go. A ghost with a voice that had ordered him to breathe, to hold on, to live. And here she was, that ghost. You saved me, he said again, softer now, as if the words were too heavy to lift. Rowan raised her eyes. They were steady, but inside she was shaking. And I watched the dust cover us both. No one moved, no one whispered. The moment lived raw in the air. Decker finally spoke, quieter still. You never tried to contact me, all these years, why? Rowan's lips parted, then pressed shut again. She inhaled through her nose, steady, controlled. I didn't know who I pulled. Your helmet was off. Your face was burned. You never spoke after the first scream, and even if I had known. She hesitated. The silence in her throat felt heavier than words. Then softly, what would I have said? Hi, I'm the soldier you erased. The words cut sharper than any blade. Decker flinched. They told me I would be helping preserve national unity, Rowan continued. That the mission's failure couldn't be public. That the entire quadrant would collapse if people knew Crimson 17 had been abandoned without clearance. I was 28. I had buried half my team. I said yes, because I thought I owed it to someone. You owed it to yourself to live, Decker murmured. Her jaw clenched. I did, quietly, alone. Her eyes scanned the soldiers in front of her, wide-eyed, silent, carrying the weight of truths they'd never been meant to hear. Her voice lowered, rough at the edges. You don't get it. Living wasn't a victory. It was punishment. Every day I breathed while their bodies burned was another day I had to remember that I walked out when they didn't, that I carried names no one would speak, and that the price of survival was silence. Her chest rose, sharp and shallow. For the first time since she'd arrived at Desert Ridge, her voice cracked. You call it life. I called it being buried alive. A beat passed, heavy, crippling. The general stood still, his own face hollowed by what she said, not because he doubted it, but because he knew it was true. You should have been honored, he said finally. His voice was low, shaking with restrained rage. They should have carved your name into stone, not erased it. Rowan gave a humorless laugh. Stone cracks easier than silence. The projector flickered. A soldier shifted in the back, uneasy, but no one dared interrupt. Decker stepped closer, not with authority, with something else, regret. I can't undo what they did, he said, but I can unbury it. Rowan's eyes lifted to his, searching. She wasn't looking for apology. Apologies were useless. She was looking for conviction. You still sign things, she said finally. He nodded. I do. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Then make it count. The air held the words like fire holds heat, slow, consuming. Decker's chest tightened. He straightened, drawing himself tall, though his limp betrayed him. He looked at the room of soldiers who had once mocked her, who now sat stunned, shaken. She isn't invisible, he said. His voice was hard now, commanding. She isn't a rumor, she isn't a ghost. She was there when the rest of her unit fell. She carried their names when the rest of us signed them away. And she carried me out when I should have died. The silence broke into something heavier. Respect, fear, recognition. Rowan lowered her gaze, the weight pressing harder now that truth had been spoken aloud. She felt exposed, vulnerable, but also something she hadn't felt in 13 years. Unhidden. But exposure carried its own danger. Because when ghosts speak, the living start asking questions. And questions were exactly what those in power had buried her to avoid. Why did they listen now, when for weeks they hadn't heard a word she said? The motor pool briefing stretched into silence long after Rowan's last words. Soldiers who had laughed at her weeks before now sat stiff-backed, staring at the tattoo she had shown, at the steadiness in her voice, at the weight of her memory. For once no one interrupted, no one sneered. Rowan let the quiet sit. She had learned long ago that silence could say more than sound. But this time, silence didn't isolate her. It held her. It carried her words further than she had expected. Finally, she clicked the projector remote again. The schematic disappeared. A blank wall glowed pale blue. You want to know what it means, she said. Her voice was low, but the room leaned closer. That mark on my spine, the broken sword, the mask, the lightning, it was never for show. It was never meant for anyone outside of Crimson 17 to see. It was how we found each other in the dark, when radios died, when smoke blinded us, when fire drowned every order we were supposed to follow. Her hand touched the back of her neck lightly, fingers grazing the edge of the ink hidden beneath her collar. It meant you're not alone. The air pressed heavy. Some soldiers shifted, not because they were restless, but because the words hit harder than expected. Rowan's gaze moved across the room, steady and unflinching. They buried our names. They buried our bodies. They said we were dead. But what they couldn't bury was what we learned out there, and I won't let that die with silence. She set down the clipboard, walked to the generator panel at the side of the room. Her hands moved across the dials with practiced ease. You want proof? Watch closely. In minutes, she had the casing open, wires stripped, fuses rerouted. Sparks hissed, then steadied into clean hums. She explained as she worked, not with the stilted cadence of training manuals, but with the clipped urgency of someone who had lived it. When your backup grid fails, you don't have time to guess. You don't have time to flip through a binder. You remember what kept you alive when it mattered. Like this. She twisted two wires, crossed a grounding line, and the console lit steady. Gasps, a few nods. Riggs scribbled notes furiously. Even Daya's, arms still crossed, leaned forward unconsciously. Rowan stepped back. Sometimes survival isn't about strength. It's about knowing where things are most likely to break, and making sure you're faster than the break. Her voice thinned at the edges, but she forced herself steady. That's what Crimson 17 carried, and that's what I'll teach, if you're willing to listen. The room was still again, but it wasn't the silence of dismissal this time. It was the silence of something shifting. Luke was the first to move. He stood slowly, almost awkwardly, and said nothing, just gave a small, sharp nod. Not regulation, not polished, but real. Rowan met his eyes for half a breath, then looked away. Granger followed next, clearing his throat. He didn't speak either. He just straightened in his seat, jaw tight, like someone who suddenly understood the weight of his own words weeks earlier. Daya's was the last, his arms loosened. His mouth opened, then shut again. Finally, he gave something Rowan hadn't expected, not apology, but a crooked salute. Clumsy, half defiant, but real. She didn't return it. She didn't need to. Because in that moment, something shifted across the base. Rumor had become recognition. Later that evening, the mess hall was quieter than usual, but not the same kind of quiet. Soldiers glanced at her not with suspicion, but with something else, something rawer, harder to name. Some looked away too quickly, as if ashamed. Others held their gaze too long, as if trying to memorize her face. No one sat at her table, not yet, but for the first time since she arrived, she wasn't entirely alone. Rowan drank her coffee slow, black as always. Inside, her chest was tight, because respect carried its own weight. Respect asked for things, respect expected, and she wasn't sure she had anything left to give. In her bunk that night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling. Memories pressed against her ribs, sand, fire, screams, silence. The way bodies had looked when the dust finally settled. The way command had told her to vanish. The way she had obeyed. She had survived by being no one, and now the truth had cracked open. Her fingers pressed to the ink on her spine, the mark she had carried all these years in secret, once a promise, once a reminder, now a beacon. The ghosts were awake again. And ghosts don't stay quiet. 2 days later, the shift became visible. Soldiers who once looked away now fell into step beside her in the motor pool. Her name, once scratched out on task lists, reappeared, this time highlighted. Someone welded a nameplate to her bench. Hail, TF Crimson. She found it one morning, brushed her hand across the steel and said nothing. Just opened her toolbox and started work. Respect had returned, but it was fragile, and Rowan knew better than anyone that fragile things don't last long under pressure. That pressure came in whispers, higher up, behind closed doors. Because recognition inside the base meant questions outside of it. And someone, somewhere, still wanted Crimson 17 erased. Why did her clearance vanish again, just when soldiers had started to trust her? Rowan felt it first at the checkpoint outside the comms building. Her badge had worked yesterday. Today it flashed red, restricted area. The sergeant at the desk shifted uneasily. "Sorry, ma'am, new protocol, you'll need to reauthorize." She didn't argue, she never did. She just turned away, her jaw tight. Later in the motor pool, she found her toolbox cracked open. Nothing missing, just shifted. A voltmeter upside down. A torque wrench off by 2 inches. Whoever had searched had wanted her to know. She closed the lid quietly. No words, no reaction, but her hand lingered on the steel longer than it should have. The soldiers who had once mocked her saw it. Luke, young and nervous, frowned. "Someone messing with you again." Rowan didn't answer. Because she knew the truth, this wasn't prank sabotage anymore. This was surveillance, pressure, the same slow choke they'd used 13 years ago when they told her to disappear. The ghosts were being hunted again. But something was different now. This time she wasn't alone. The younger soldiers had begun sitting near her in the mess. At first hesitant, now deliberate. Luke asked questions about wiring sequences. Granger, once her loudest critic, left a rethreaded voltage meter on her tray without a word. Even Diaz, stiff and awkward, gave her nods of acknowledgement. It wasn't friendship. Not yet, but it was respect. And respect, Rowan knew, was dangerous currency. It made people watch. It made people listen. It made silence harder to enforce. That week she found herself cornered in the hangar by Sergeant Keller, older, limping, eyes that had seen too much. He lowered his voice. "You're not the only one. There are others, scattered, hiding in plain sight. A climber in Idaho, a boxing coach in El Paso. They never talk, but you can see it in the way they watch exits. The ghosts are still out there." Rowan's throat tightened, and they stayed silent. Keller nodded, "Just like you did." Her chest felt heavy, because silence had protected them, but it had also left them buried alive. And now, standing in the hangar, she realized the choice was no longer hers alone. Because if she stayed quiet, the soldiers watching her, the young ones, the ones still green and eager, would learn the wrong lesson. That survival meant silence. That truth meant punishment. That ghost should never speak. She couldn't let that be what they carried. But to break silence meant risk. Risk of being erased again. Risk of being hunted harder. Risk of drawing fire that wouldn't stop at her. That night she sat alone at the edge of the loading dock, boots off, tin cup of coffee in her hands. The desert was black around her, stars sharp above. The wind whispered through steel. Decker found her there, again. "You know what comes next," he said quietly. She didn't look at him. Pressure, scrutiny, disappearance. "Unless you speak first." Her lips curved bitterly. "Speak. To who? Soldiers who already suspect more than they can handle. Command who's already rewriting the files." He stepped closer, his limp heavy in the sand. "Not to them, to all of them, out loud in front of the base." Rowan's throat worked. She finally looked at him. His face was stone, but his eyes were alive with conviction she hadn't seen in years. "You want me to burn the silence down," she said. "I want you to stop carrying it alone." Her hand tightened around the cup. The metal bit into her palm. She thought about Cortez, Nugan, Ferris, Lynn, faces she hadn't seen in 13 years but carried every night. She thought about the fire, the screams, the smoke that had never cleared from her lungs. And she thought about the young soldier who had dropped his toolkit the other day, fumbling, embarrassed, and the way she had bent to help him gather the pieces. Maybe Decker was right. Maybe it wasn't about her anymore. The next morning the announcement went out, all units, mandatory briefing. Motorpool Bay 1, 900 hours. No one questioned it, but everyone felt it. Something was different. The benches were full. Soldiers leaned against walls, arms crossed, pretending it was routine but knowing it was. The projector hummed. The air was heavy. And then Rowan stepped forward, clipboard in hand, boots polished, jumpsuit zipped high. Not a ghost, not a rumor, not a technician. A soldier. She looked across the faces, the doubters, the believers, the curious, and she felt her heart hammering like it had in Ulhudra, when silence was the only thing keeping her alive. But this time she didn't stay silent. "This tattoo," she began, pulling the collar down just enough to show the jagged lightning again, "wasn't meant for anyone else. It was how we found each other in fire. It was how we reminded ourselves that even when the radios died, we weren't alone. Crimson 17 wasn't a rumor. We weren't ghosts. We were soldiers, and they buried us because it was easier than explaining why we were sent to die without extraction." The room went still. Soldiers leaned forward unconsciously. "I lived," she continued, her voice breaking raw, "not because I was stronger, not because I was braver, but because I was unlucky enough to survive when the rest of my unit didn't. And I let them erase me. I let them bury my name, because I thought silence was duty, because I thought silence was loyalty." Her throat caught, she steadied it. "But silence isn't loyalty. Silence is chains, and I won't wear them anymore." The words rang out, louder than any order, sharper than any command. And then, before anyone could respond, the bay doors opened again. Boots echoed against concrete. Decker entered, alone. He didn't shout, he didn't need to. His voice carried like stone against steel. "There are stories we don't tell, not because they're untrue, but because someone decided they were inconvenient. But every system has its ghosts, and sometimes those ghosts walk among us, fixing what no one else can, teaching what no manual ever will." He didn't say her name, he didn't have to. Every eye turned to her, every breath caught. Rowan stood taller, her heart beating raw in her chest. She had spoken. He had spoken. The silence was broken. But outside that bay, she knew the system was listening. And systems didn't forgive ghosts who refused to stay buried. Why didn't anyone mock her anymore? The days after the briefing moved differently. No one said much, but silence had changed shape. It wasn't the silence of exile anymore. It was the silence of recognition. In the motor pool, soldiers who had once scattered when she entered now fell into step beside her. Tasks that had been stripped from her name reappeared on rosters, this time not crossed out, but highlighted. Someone welded a fresh nameplate onto her workbench, Hail, TF Crimson. Rowan found it one morning, brushed her fingers across the cold steel, and said nothing. Just opened her toolbox and went back to work. Respect didn't need words. But the base itself felt different now. Luke sat across from her at the mess one afternoon, tray clattering nervously onto the table. "You were right," he muttered, staring at his coffee. "About that capacitor trick, cut our load time in half." Rowan only nodded. "It holds better if you cross-ground the fuse junction." The boy smiled awkwardly, grateful, before going quiet again. Later, Granger approached without speaking. He left a small envelope on her tray. Inside, a clean, rethreaded voltage meter. The same kind he'd ruined her first week. He didn't apologize, he didn't need to. The act was enough. Even Diaz, once her sharpest critic, gave a crooked salute one morning. It wasn't regulation. It wasn't smooth. But it was real. Rowan returned it with a slight nod, enough to say she saw him, and enough to let him keep his pride. The shift was subtle but steady. Where once there had been suspicion, now there was something closer to reverence. Not loud, not ceremonial, but lived. And then, one morning during routine roll call, General Decker stood at the front of the assembly. He read through his notes, issued the usual orders, and before dismissal he cleared his throat. "One final note," he said. "Effective immediately, civilian contractor Rowan Hale will serve as senior advisor to all power systems operations and training." Murmurs rippled across the ranks, some clapped quietly, a few smiled. Rowan stood at the back, hands folded behind her. She didn't step forward. She didn't need to. Because she had never wanted rank, only space to serve. That night when the desert winds sharpened and the stars hung heavy over the compound, Rowan returned to the bench behind the motor pool. Same tin cup, same boots unlaced, same silence. But this time she wasn't alone. 3 young soldiers approached, toolboxes in hand. They didn't ask if they could sit. They simply sat. Rowan glanced at them, then back at the horizon. "Lesson starts at 1900, she said, sipping her coffee. No fanfare, no declaration, just a survivor passing down what manuals never could. And that became her rhythm. She didn't return to command rooms. She didn't demand recognition. She taught. She repaired. She sat quietly in the corners of the base, offering lessons that came not from textbooks but from scars. Sometimes recruits asked questions she didn't answer. "What really happened in Ol Hudra?" they whispered. Rowan only shook her head. "Not everything survives fire." Other times she told them exactly what they needed. "When systems fail, don't panic. Trust your hands. Trust the training that isn't written down. Sometimes survival isn't about strength. It's about knowing where things are most likely to break." The younger ones listened, really listened, because they knew she wasn't giving them theory. She was giving them the fragments of survival she had carried alone for too long. Weeks passed, the base shifted fully. No one called her civilian anymore. No one called her contractor. She was something else now, something heavier, something earned. She didn't ask for it. She didn't even want it. But she bore it because she knew what it meant for those who came after. And sometimes late at night, when the compound was quiet and the desert wind swept dust across the steel, Rowan felt the weight of ghosts settle around her again. Cortez, Nugan, Ferris, Lynn, all of them, names no one else remembered, faces no one else saw in their dreams. She whispered to them in the silence, not apologies, not explanations, just acknowledgement, just memory. Because memory was the only grave they had. 2 weeks later, a new batch of recruits arrived. Young, loud, careless. They joked too hard, carried themselves like they already knew war. Rowan leaned against the wall of the tool depot, watching them scatter across the yard. One dropped his kit. Fuses clattered across the floor. The others laughed. Rowan stepped forward, crouched, helped him gather the pieces. "Thanks, ma'am," he said, sheepish. "You assigned to our squad." She handed him the last fuse. "No, but I've walked your path before." The boy blinked. "Were you an instructor?" "No," Rowan said softly. "Just someone who remembers what it's like to carry gear you're not ready for." The recruit straightened, uncertain, then gave a nervous salute. She returned it with barely a nod, but it was enough. That was how stories lived on. Not in manuals, not in medals, but in small moments of truth passed down quietly, hand to hand, memory to memory. Rowan never reclaimed her file. She never asked to be written back into the official record. She didn't need to. Her recognition lived in the silence before her name was spoken, in the tools that stayed where she left them, in the soldiers who sat beside her without asking, and in the quiet respect of a general who once signed her death away and now trusted her to keep his base alive. On a Sunday morning, as the sun bled over the ridge, the base gathered for roll call. Routine, nothing special. Decker read through notes, issued updates, prepared to dismiss, and then he paused. "There are stories we don't tell," he said. "Not because they aren't true, but because someone decided they were inconvenient. But those stories don't disappear. They live in the people who carry them. They live in the ghosts who never left." He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. Every soldier turned, eyes landing on the woman at the back. Rowan stood quietly, boots planted, arms folded, gaze steady. No denial, no apology, no pride, just presence. And that was enough. That night she sat again on the bench with her tin cup, staring into the vast desert sky. Keller joined her, limping as always. "They know now," he said. "Some of it," she replied. "Enough." Rowan sipped her coffee. "Think they'll remember?" Keller smiled faintly. "Only the right ones will. The others never mattered." She let the silence stretch. The stars above felt endless. "Sometimes," she said at last, her voice low, almost to herself, "dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts." The desert wind carried her words into the dark. And Rowan Hale sat in that stillness, scarred, seen, and finally remembered.